Olga of Dolsgaard. Rumo of Zamonia, a plump little schoolmistress with the face of a bulldog, was standing in the doorway. "Is that you?" Rumo stood up. "Come with me," she barked. "My name is Olga of Dolsgaard," she went on as she towed Rumo along the corridor. "You share your name with a card game. Did you realize that?" "Yes," said Rumo. "Where are we going?" "I shall be teaching you to read and write." "But I've got fencing next." "The others have. You've got reading." She conducted him along the corridor and down into the basement of the school building, past discarded classroom furniture and stacks of yellowing dog-eared school books. Their trek ended in a small, ill-lit room where 3 other pupils were waiting. Rumo sat down with a sigh. One thing was certain. There was no escaping from this cellar, not even visually, because it had no windows through which to gaze. It was dimly illuminated by some big flickering candles. The teacher spent the next few seemingly interminable hours holding up cards that depicted simple objects and creatures. A teapot, a wheel, a cat, a duck, a hat, a mouse, and writing the relevant words on a blackboard for the class to copy in their exercise books. This she did with relentless persistence, picture after picture and word after word for hour after hour, over and over again until Rumo and his fellow prisoners could have written the words in their sleep. Olga concluded the lesson by informing her pupils that they would not be permitted to undergo any combat training until they had mastered at least the rudiments of reading and writing. She stifled their protests by stating that this was the rule and that she made no secret of the fact that it had been instituted to encourage them to learn the Zamonian alphabet all the quicker. "A donkey," she said, "trots faster if you dangle a carrot in front of its nose." When Rumo emerged from school that afternoon, it took him some time to become accustomed to the dazzling glare of the setting sun. Urs was waiting for him with a string of fresh sausages around his neck. "Been down in the dungeon, have you?" He grinned. "They teach reading and writing in that gloomy hole to persuade you to learn quicker. It really works. You're so anxious to get out of there as soon as possible you beaver away like mad. I learned to read and write in 6 weeks flat." 6 weeks? You call that quick? If you flunked the exam, it could take 12. Like a sausage? The dungeon. Rumo spent most of the time in isolation for the next few weeks, cooped up in the dungeon with Olga of Dolsgaard and his 3 fellow victims. Now and then he was permitted to attend a lesson on dental hygiene or listen to a lecture on Wolpertinkian general knowledge, but whenever his classmates trooped off en masse to fencing lessons, he was shut up in the cellar, being forced to memorize the signs for soap, ball, tree, or oven. The words they learned to spell became longer every day, and soon they could dispense with pictures on cards. Rumo found it interesting that you could capture objects on a sheet of paper by writing down the letters that spelt them. Pretending you were hunting them made learning easier. He sat there imprisoned in a gloomy dungeon, but his imagination he was out on the sunlit prairie, spearing wild words with his pencil. What really irked him was being separated from Rala while Ushan DeLuca might well be teaching her and Rolf and the others how to slice an opponent in half with a saber. The evenings he spent laboriously copying out the Zamonian alphabet at home in his room because he had vowed to pass the exam at the first attempt and embark on combat training as soon as possible. At night he dreamt of letters and Rala. Civic duties. Although Rumo regarded the school building as a battleground characterized by spiteful enemies, Rolf, imponderable dangers, Rala, interminable torments, chess, humiliating captivity, the cellar, and the cruel persecution, mathematics, the rest of Wolpertine was a place where he could give free rein to his inclinations and aptitudes. He scored some notable triumphs where his civic duties were concerned, largely because of his manual dexterity. Hand Rumo a mason's trowel, and he would erect a stout brick wall within hours. Give him a shovel, and he would single-handedly excavate the foundations of an entire building. To his own surprise, he found he could do almost anything at the first attempt, as long as it involved physical or manual labor. It took him only a few weeks to master the rudiments of the potter's craft. A blacksmith taught him to fashion wrought iron and shoe horses. He could make bricks and dig wells. He welcomed any form of physical exercise in the belief that it would hone his body and reflexes in preparation for combat training. Every activity improved his stamina and exercised a different set of muscles and sinews. His paws were strengthened by working at the potter's wheel, his legs by running errands, his arms by laying bricks, his shoulders by hammering horseshoes, his back by shoveling earth. Laboring at a hot stove inured him to pain and fishing, and the fast-flowing waters of the Wolver speeded his reactions. Ornt El Okro's workshop. One afternoon, when Rumo walked into a cabinet-maker's workshop to deliver a bulk of timber for Zaruso the timber merchant, he was overwhelmed by a multitude of sensory impressions. Most Wolpertines would have found them uninteresting or even unpleasant, but to Rumo's ears the scream of the foot-operated circular saw was like music. As for the smell of wood, glue, and varnish, it seemed as delicious to his nose as the aroma of a Sunday joint. He surveyed the surroundings, sniffing delightedly, reflected by the wood dust in the air. The sunlight slanting down through the workshop's little windows seemed to bathe every tool in a magical glow. Standing in the middle of the room were two big black benches strewn with wooden shavings. On them lay various planes, a gouge, some keyhole saws, and a miter box. Each bench had a massive vise bolted to it. Rumo unloaded the bulk of timber and went over to one of the benches. Ignoring the cabinet maker, he was mechanically cutting up a plank on the pedal-operated saw bench. He took an offcut from the floor, clamped it between two pegs, and proceeded to plane it. Ornt El Okro, the cabinet maker, removed his foot from the pedal and turned to look. A young Wolpertine was standing at one of his benches, planning away at an offcut. This was not only odd, it was outrageous. He alone was entitled to train apprentice cabinet makers, and he alone decided whose apprentices should be. And if someone was an apprentice of his, he alone decided that someone should do. Ornt suspected that his neighbors had sent this young stranger to his workshop as a practical joke. He went to the door and peered out, but there was no one in sight. When he turned back again, the impudent youngster had gone over to his lathe and was turning a chair leg. Instead of giving Rumo a piece of his mind and throwing him out of the workshop right away, as he had intended to, Ornt leant against the beam and watched him. He had never seen anyone turn a chair leg so fast. Rumo removed the leg from the lathe, weighed it experimentally in his paws, laid it aside, and started to turn another. Ornt lit his pipe. After producing 4 chair legs in the time it would have taken Ornt himself to complete one, Rumo took a largest slab of wood from a shelf and proceeded to fashion a seat in the same incredibly swift, craftsman-like manner. Next, he constructed the back of the chair from 3 turned spindles and 1 spoke-shaved crosspiece. Having briefly snipped 20 pots of glue, he unerringly selected the one Ornt himself would have chosen. He drilled 3 holes in the seat and crosspiece, glued the spindles into them, secured them with screws, and smoothed the edges with sandpaper. Rumo deposited the chair in the middle of the workshop and sat down on it. It emitted a last little groan as the screws, timber, and glue adapted themselves to their new environment. Not until then did Rumo look at Ornt El Okro, vaguely, as if awaking from a pleasant dream. Six weeks. I don't remember. Oh, it must have been something earlier in the story. Hi, Nelson. I'd like to be a cabinet maker, he said. You already are one, said Ornt. As soon as the 4 prisoners in the dungeon could read whole sentences, spell the words of which they were composed, and write them down, their instruction in reading and writing were reduced to 2 hours a day, and they were permitted to attend ordinary lessons more often. Rumo enjoyed being back in Rala's immediate vicinity, and his ability to read and write lessons a different character. He was not only capable of deciphering what teachers wrote on the blackboard, but he could even jot down the occasional note. However, it riled him to see the increasingly blatant way in which Rolf sought Rala's company. What was more, Rala didn't object. Rolf was forever dancing attendance on her during break. He shamelessly showed off in front of her, scuffling with his classmates, and once he even gave her an apple, which to Rumo's horror, she actually accepted. He himself would never have taken such a liberty. In fact, he still hadn't exchanged a word with her. The most audacious thing he'd done in this respect was to write their names side by side on a slip of paper, but he'd torn it into little pieces immediately afterwards. Heroes. Although he still wasn't permitted to take part in combat training, Rumo now went to school as a matter of course because he'd grasped that he couldn't have one thing without the other. Chess lessons he found a torment, being the diametrical opposite of what came naturally to him whenever an opponent had maneuvered him into a hopeless position during a lesson. Something that happened all the time, he yearned to pick up the board and hit him over the head with it. However, it was one of the fundamental rules of chess that you didn't do such a thing. Worse still, Rala was the school's leading exponent of the game. She was every bit a match for the teachers and could play several classmates at once, sometimes as many as 10 of them. Worst of all, the only person who seemed more or less a match for her was Rolf. She fought endless duels with him, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. Rumo envied Rolf all the time he spent so close to her. Mathematics was a little better. It wasn't that Rumo couldn't do maths. He didn't want to. Everything within him balked at adding, subtracting, or dividing abstract figures. Words he liked, he could fill them with images or sensations, and they helped him in everyday life, whereas numbers only confused him. Maths was like trying to class smoke with your paws, or munch a scent. Maths was for bores, for building accountants and bank managers. Sure enough, the biggest bores in his class were the best at figures. Even during break, they would stand there cracking the mathematical brain teasers they'd begged the teacher to set them. Rumo spent maths lessons gazing out of the window and hoping that the teacher wouldn't summon him to the blackboard. This the teacher eventually ceased to do because Rumo seemed such a hopeless case that time spent on him was time wasted. The heroic sagas, on the other hand, were a subject after Rumo's own heart. He happily memorized the heroes and heroines' resounding names and deeds. Condor the Bold, who had strangled the 3 child-eating bears of Paul Island, Dogmo the Doughty, who at the age of 190 had repaired a breach in the Much-Water Dam by plugging it with his own body, or Andromeda Crystal, who became a frozen memorial to her own self-sacrifice by pouring water over herself during a blizzard on the shores of Shivering Sound, thereby forming a windbreak that shielded her children from the icy wind. However, his lessons on the heroic sagas made Rumo painfully aware of something. Heroes were always of another species. The occupants of Lindworm Castle who had repelled the Darkmen, the diabolical Death's Heads, and the Copper Killers, the princesses of Graelsund, who had defended their city against the Mist Witches, or the Oaken the Mighty, who, singing as he did so, be it noted, plunged to his death complete with the bridge over Watlin's Cleft to prevent the vampire army from crossing it. Almost every Zamonian lifeform had its heroes, but not the Wolpertings. No Wolperting had ever been a hero, not a single solitary one, not even Hoth. True, he enjoyed universal popularity, but all he'd done was enter a deserted city. That didn't make him a hero. Wolperting had never been besieged. The city had never sustained a catastrophic natural disaster, never been ravaged by fire or attacked by an army of demons on which its inhabitants could have tested their capacity for heroism. It was as if a danger steered clear of the city, deterred by the Wolperting's reputation and warlike appearance. Rumo felt sure he had the makings of a hero. His prowess on roaming rock was certainly cut from the cloth of which lessons on the heroic sagas were tailored, but there was no one around to sing his praises. Smike was far away. Some of the Hakonians might possibly be recounting his heroic deeds to their children, but there was no guarantee that they were even pronouncing his name correctly. For all anyone knew or cared, they might be calling him Moru or Urmo. No, there were no 2 ways about it. Rumo had had his chance to be a hero, and he'd blown it. As for encountering perilous adventures within these city walls, He had as much prospect of that as beating Rala at chess. The Black Dome. Hara of Midgard's lessons on Wolpertingian general knowledge were a peculiar mismatch of biology, history, etiquette, rules, facts, and legends, of practical information and absurd speculation, a kind of stew made up of scraps from every branch of knowledge that had failed to qualify as a subject in its own right. They might be devoted to the olfactory perceptions of danger, or the system of civic duties, or the hygienic importance of Wolperting's public conveniences, or the dangers of trying to swim. Hara's pupils never knew what awaited them in one of his general knowledge lessons. This time his subject was the Black Dome. The Black Dome, he pontificated, was here before we existed, is here with us now, and will still be here long after we have ceased to exist. He left the form to chew on this enigma for a few moments before continuing. There's a theory that the dome was really a sphere composed of some non-Zomodian metal from outer space. Indeed, there are some who believe that it's a meteor half buried in the ground, and that the city was erected around it a long time ago. What supports this theory is that no one has ever discovered what material it consists of. He wrote one meteor theory on the blackboard. Another theory is that the unknown builders of Wolperting constructed the Black Dome last of all, using some material that no longer exists. Stupidly, they built the dome from the outside in and forgot to leave a door, thereby entombing themselves and dying a miserable death from lack of oxygen. If this theory is correct, there's a building in the middle of our city full of skeletons. He wrote, too, tomb theory on the blackboard. A third theory claims that the dome neither fell from the sky nor was artificially constructed, but is an organic growth. A stone plant, a metal mushroom, possibly a boil emanating from the center of the earth. If the last alternative is correct, I wouldn't like to be here when the boil bursts. Everyone laughed and Hara wrote 3. Boil theory on the blackboard. What all these theories really imply, and I could quote you several dozen more, is that there's no rational explanation for the Black Dome's existence. My own very personal theory is this: whether it existed before Wolperting was built, or was erected by the builders of the city themselves, the Black Dome seems to me a sculpture symbolic of the great unknown, a gigantic question mark designed to remind us all that for as long as we live, one task will never be completed, the one performed in here. Hara tapped his skull with his knuckles. I know it won't appeal to you, the notion of never-ending task, but you must reconcile yourselves to the idea that brainwork and the thirst for knowledge, the desire to solve riddles, will never cease. Rumo was reminded of Smite's riddle. What grows shorter and shorter the longer it gets? He still hadn't found the answer. The ambush. Rumo was rather proud of his newly acquired knowledge of the alphabet. Lately, when walking home from school with Urs in the evening, he'd taken to reading out every sign as they passed. Well, how was in the dungeon? Municipal Bakery. Care for a Frankfurter? Hoff Boulevard. I think I'm going to give up the sausage factory and start work at the bakery. I'm getting sick of sausages. Zaruso and Sons Timber Merchants. Maybe I should get a job in the communal kitchen. No fly tipping. Or a restaurant of my own, that would be best. I've already got a whole folder full of recipes, all invented by me. Clean your teeth 5 times a day. What Wolperting needs is some Florentine cuisine. Our local nosh is so utterly unrefined. Leatherware of all kinds. I'd screw chessboards to the tables. Then the customers could go on playing during their meals and wouldn't have to stop eating. Fire station, keep clear. And you could be my partner. I'll cook, you wash up, and eject the drunks. We'll go 50-50. If the joint does well, we'll open a whole chain of restaurants. Ches, Urs, and Rumo, Hoth Avenue. Or Ches, Rumo, and Urs, if you prefer. Florentine cuisine, that's the gap in the market. Light and sophisticated is the coming trend. Danger, fast-flowing river, bathing prohibited. Hey, have you been listening to a word I say? Municipal laundry. How's the spelling going? Making progress? They took the usual shortcut via Laundry Lane. The alleyway running behind the municipal laundry, an area Wolpertings tended to shun because the detergent's acrid fumes offended their keen sense of smell. Rumo and Urs were holding their noses as usual. so they failed to detect what awaited them round the next bend. There, standing amid some big baskets brimming with dirty laundry and looking studiously offhand, were Rolf and his gang, Vasco of the Red Forest, Bala of Betaville, and Oleg of the Dunes. An ambush, Urs hissed. The foursome sauntered into the middle of the alley, barring their path. What do you want? Urs demanded. Nothing to do with you, said Vasco, so stay out of this. We'll see about that, Urs replied quietly. Rumo was surprised by his menacing tone of voice. Cool it, Urs, said Bala. We aren't involved either. This is just between Rolf and Rumo. Rolf grinned. And this time there's no Rala around to let you off the hook. If you want to get past, you'll have to go through me. Hold this, said Rumo. He handed Urs his satchel. Vasco, Bala, and Oleg retired to the pavement while Rolf performed some limbering up exercises. All right, get cracking, said Oleg. Wolpertingen street fighting rules apply. No weapons, no teeth. Everything else goes. The fight lasts till one of you gives up. Time. The Battle of Laundry Lane. Had there existed a secret history of Wolperting, a chronicle of all the memorable events that had occurred in the city's backyards and gloomy alleyways, cellars and ruins, it would undoubtedly have included several chapters devoted to the Black Dome. There would have been one section that solved the mystery of the notch in the mayor's head, and another that explained how Hoff contrived to populate a deserted city with nothing but Wolpertings. There would also have been an account of the wooden sword fight that waged some 50 years earlier by the Reds and the Blacks, two rival gangs of the schoolboys, and a detailed description of the 3-day duel with raw eggs which Ort el Okro, then in his youth, had fought with Hacho of the Wolves. As for the fight between Rumo and Rolf, it would have gone down in the city's secret annals as the Battle of Laundry Lane. Unfortunately, however, no such history existed. To call their fight a battle was justified, if only because all who witnessed it gained the impression that the combatants numbered a dozen, not just two. The strength, stamina, and endurance displayed by both parties would have sufficed to put an army of werewolves to flight. This clash amid the acrid fumes of Laundry Lane seemed less between two creatures of flesh and blood than between two elemental forces or evil spirits endowed with supernatural powers. It might have been fair to give Rolf a 1-point handicap during the preliminaries, not only because of his friend's yells of encouragement, but because he had mastered various tactics of which Rumo still knew nothing. Rolf hit hard and often, and he was shrewd enough not to neglect his own guard. He was immensely skilled at ducking and weaving, so most of Rumo's punches missed their mark. But Rumo did not make the mistake of losing his temper. He took Rolf's punches and absorbed them without flinching, and it wasn't long before he had the measure of his well-trained opponent. He became accustomed to his speed and his tricks, had gauged his strength and its limits. Rumo was a good scrapper by nature, and this scrap was teaching him a great deal. Increasingly thwarted by Rumo's more effective guard, Rolf was not only landing fewer punches, but sustaining some painful blows himself. It was as if the two of them had swapped roles. Rumo was returning each of Rolf's attacks with interest, imitating his movements perfectly, appropriating his technique. Now it was Rolf's turn to suppress his mounting fury. One punch connected so unerringly with his left eye that it swelled up within seconds. His friend's shouts of encouragement were definitely growing fainter, whereas Urs were steadily increasing in volume. Rolf sensed that a change of tactics was indicated, so he tried to embroil Rumo in a wrestling match on the ground, never suspecting that his opponent was better equipped in that respect. Here, where swift reflexes counted for more than technique, Rumo enjoyed an advantage from the start. His lightning holds were harder to break, his limbs more supple, his strength and stamina greater. They rolled around in the dirt, growling and snarling, knocking over laundry baskets and tumbling down the cellar steps. But Rolf always ended up in a headlock or flat on his back, while Rumo sitting on his chest and bombarding him with punches. Rolf realized that he was bound to acquire another black eye sooner or later, so he broke off the wrestling match and switched to a form of fighting at which he was the best in the school, kickboxing. Scrambling to his feet, he adopted the basic kickboxing position, legs slightly bent, shoulders back, both fists at eye level. Now I'm going to finish you, he announced. I'm waiting, Rumo retorted. Now you're for it. I'm still waiting. I'm going to make you eat dirt. I'm still waiting. They were both breathing heavily, and their fur was sodden with sweat. They circled each other for a while, recouping their energies as they continued their dialogue in the same vein. Now I'm going to show you the difference between a civilized Wolperting and a wild one, Rolf said menacingly. I'll show you what you can learn in school if you pay attention. Rumo got ready for another furious exchange of punches, only to encounter a sudden flurry of kicks. Rolf used his fists only in order to regain his balance while lashing out with his feet. He launched these attacks in a variety of ways, standing, leaning backwards, lying on the ground, leaping, rotating his body, scything the air with his leg. The kicks landed with the force of a battering ram. Laundry Lane resounded to a series of dull thuds as they bit into Rumo's body. Urs winced as his friend was knocked about like a lifeless straw doll. Blow followed blow in such quick succession that he had no chance to protect himself adequately. Rolf ran through his entire repertoire. He kicked Rumo in the back, in the stomach, on the shins. He kicked him wherever he chose, and as hard as he could. But one thing he failed to do, he couldn't put his opponent down for good. Rumo struggled to his feet every time, puffing and blowing, but always with his wits about him. Urs wished he would abandon the fight and spare himself further punishment. Rolf resorted to his fists again. Rumo was subjected to a volley of punches, and from all directions, left, right, above, below. He had also sustained a black eye by now, and had almost ceased to fight back. He was merely endeavoring to stay on his feet and protect his head, while Rolf belabored his body like a punch bag. Vasco, Bala, and Oleg were urging their friend on again, and their cries redoubled the speed of his onslaughts. Simply unable to watch any more, Urs averted his gaze for the first time, and missed the best punch of the entire fight, a perfect uppercut from Rumo that landed smack on Rolf's chin. Rolf took 3 unsteady steps backwards, fought to clear his head for several seconds, and just stood there with his knees buckling. Now they were both in dire straits. Rolf had expended all his energy and escaped defeat by a hair's breadth. Rumo had conserved his strength, but taken innumerable punishing blows to the body. Ponderously they went for each other again. Darkness had followed by now. The laundry was shut, and everyone who worked there had gathered in the lane to watch the spectacle. Torches had been kindled, and their light sent Rolf's and Rumo's huge shadows dancing across the whitewashed walls. Utterly exhausted, they relapsed into a war of words, a contest in which neither displayed much talent or imagination. "I'll get you. Come on, then. Don't worry, I will. All right, I'm waiting. Yellow belly. Yellow belly yourself. Chicken. Chicken yourself. Scaredy cat yourself." Urs had grown tired of watching. He toyed with the idea of knocking them out with a coal shovel, so peace would at last be restored, and they could all go home. Before long, however, no such measure seemed necessary, because Rolf and Rumo had tripped over their own feet. They circled one another at a crawl, each trying for a necklock. The other spectators' enthusiasm had also waned, and some were already leaving the scene yawning. Rumo finally succeeded in getting a stranglehold on Rolf just as Rolf got him in a scissors hold. They remained in this position motionless for quite some time. Urs, Bala, Vasco, and Oleg eventually went over, intending to separate the pair before they could do each other any more damage, but Rumo and Rolf weren't fighting any longer. They had fallen asleep in each other's arms. The outcome of the fight seemed clear. So most of the spectators had dispersed by now. The Battle of Laundry Lane was over. Bala and Oleg carried Rolf home, while Vasco helped Urs to put Rumo, who was snoring loudly, to bed. The examination. When Rumo woke up the next morning, he couldn't at first account for all his aches and pains. He thought he was seriously ill until Urs came in with some coffee and refreshed his memory. Who won? Who won? Rumo asked. That remains to be seen. You really must get up and go to school. If you fail to show, everyone will interpret it as a victory for Rolf. I don't think I can. I'll help you. First have some coffee. Rumo hobbled to the school leaning on Urs. Outside the gates they met Rolf, who was being carried rather than supported by Vasco and Bala. They made it to their places in class and slept through the first 2 periods, both of which were devoted to chess. The legend of the Battle of Laundry Lane was already spreading like wildfire, complete with a few preliminary exaggerations. Next, Rumo dragged himself off to a lesson in the cellar. Although he could scarcely keep his eyes open, Olga of Dolsgaard's curiously solemn and silent manner wasn't lost on him. Without a word, she handed out some blank sheets of paper and pencils, and they all suddenly grasped that the crucial examination was imminent. None of them had been expecting it, and it couldn't have come at a worse time for Rumo in particular. He could scarcely remember his own name. The schoolmistress dictated a short text consisting of simple sentences. The cat drinks milk. The bird lays an egg. The chicken crosses the road. The werewolf sleeps in the forest. Rumo and his classmates wrote them down, panting and groaning as if engaged in some strenuous physical activity. Then Olga of Dolsgaard collected their papers and sat down at her desk to correct them in silence. Her pen scratched away, lacerating their nerves. As the minutes crawled by, Rumo wondered if he'd spelt werewolf correctly. Should it have been werewolf? At long last, Olga handed back the sheets of paper without a word, her grim expression seeming to imply that the whole class had been failed miserably. Well, she said, as though accusing them of some inexpiable sin. You've all passed the examination, but don't go thinking you can now read and write. You have, however, acquired a tool that will enable you to decipher every word you come across. It's in your heads. Look after that tool. Look after it as carefully as you clean your teeth. The best way of doing that is to read. Read as much as you can. Read street signs and menus. Read the notices outside City Hall. Read trashy paperbacks for all I care, but read. Read or you'll be done for. Olga focused her dread gaze on each pupil in turn. From tomorrow you'll be allowed to take part in combat training. To those of you who may regard this as an honor or a pleasure, I would say this, it's neither one nor the other. Many of you will yearn for the days when you learnt to spell one-syllable words under my supervision, but by then it will be too late. Combat instruction. Rumo was allowed to take part in combat training the very next day, but that, too, could not have come at a worse time. Although he ached in every limb and could only see properly with one eye, he struggled gamely through the first few lessons. Indeed, he would probably have attended class decapitated, but his severed head beneath his arm. After a week, the bruises he'd acquired in the Battle of Laundry Lane began to fade, to be replaced by new ones sustained in training. Kickboxing, boxing, wrestling, aerial combat, fighting on all fours, biting, those were the unarmed combat disciplines. The ones that involved fighting with weapons were nocturnal fencing, axe-wielding, ball and chain, crossbowmanship, archery, and blind knife throwing. Most of the pupils soon discovered what suited them and what didn't. In Rumo's own opinion, he had a natural aptitude for every discipline. You had to master the rudiments of unarmed combat before embarking on weapons training. Physical control was the prime requirement. If you couldn't master your own body, you couldn't master a weapon. Rumo was surprised at all that he had still to learn. Holds, punches, kicks, leaps, defensive and disengagement in techniques, tactics, and teamwork. He had never applied himself to the fundamentals of movements or engaged in stamina-enhancing and limbering-up exercises. He was now taught how to flex his sinews, warm up his muscles, and run for hours without becoming winded. Training often took place outside the school. On their long endurance runs, Rumo and his classmates became familiar not only with the forests, hills, and fields around Wolperting, but also with the streets and steps, bridges and squares of Wolperting itself, especially with the great wall, on which one could run right around the city. Training took place wherever conditions for a particular discipline were ideal. It was commonplace for pupils to be catapulted into the air in Hoth Square to teach them aerial combat. Citizens who crossed one of the bridges and found themselves in the midst of a mass riot had no need to alert the mayor's office. It was just a collective limbering-up exercise. Battle cries rent the air as youthful trainees sprinted along the alleyways of the inner city. Loudly urged on by their instructors, the atmosphere of Wolperting as a whole was colored by combat training. Rumo learned to treat his own body like an extremely intricate, sensitive machine requiring careful maintenance. The functions of the bones, muscles, nerves, and sensory organs were explained during lessons devoted to theory. Stances, holds, kicks, blows, leaps, and defensive measures were drummed into the pupils' heads. They had to memorize them with the aid of diagrams and learn their often bizarre names by heart. The double mitten, the serpentine strange hold, the narcotic sledgehammer, the lethal butterfly punch, the cockerel kick, the twin-fingered thrust with elbow follow-up. One discipline to which everyone attached great importance was that of biting. Wolpertings regarded biting as the noblest and most natural form of combat, just as teeth were nature's most precious gift. A fundamental distinction was drawn between bites intended to warn, grip, restrain, crush, tear, lacerate, and kill. Biting was one of Rumo's favorite subjects. He noticed that far from all Wolpertings took the same interest in combat training as he did. Those who were descended from more peaceable and easygoing canine breeds, the ones with pug faces or floppy ears, used to stand aside with their chessboards under their arms and pour scorn over those who enjoyed clobbering each other. But there were plenty of pupils who distinguished themselves like him, displayed above-average ambition, and did their utmost to become top of the class in one or more subjects. Roloff, for instance, was an excellent archer. Rolf had a talent for knife-throwing that would have earned him a job in any circus. Bala excelled at aerial combat, Vasco was very proficient with the crossbow, and Oleg's forte was the sling, a weapon few Wolpertings rated highly. Rumo was particularly good at four-legged combat, a technique that had been developed at the school itself. In this discipline, Wolpertings were taught how to return to their roots, how to use their arms like legs and their legs like arms. Rumo learnt there was nothing magical about scaling the wall of a building. It was merely a question of practice. Rumo and Rolf often came up against each other in training, but from now on with mutual respect. Although the Battle of Laundry Lane had not made friends of them, their burning desire to defeat one another in combat seemed to have evaporated, so they avoided one another by tacit agreement. If they competed at all, it was only in accumulating as much knowledge as possible of as many subjects as possible. A challenge. "Who'd like to take me on?" Ushan DeLuca's words died away. It was Rumo's first lesson with the legendary swordsman. He was surprised to note that the pupils on the benches around him had lowered their gaze. They were all trying to avoid the teacher's eye. "What's the matter? Are you Wolpertings or sheep? Born fighters or born cowards?" DeLuca strutted up and down in front of the benches, noisily slashing the air with his rapier. "Tss, with the rapier. "So you're sheep, are you? Look at me. Look me in the eye, you yellow bellies." Ushan DeLuca was in one of his grim moods. Everyone in the class could tell. Everyone except Rumo. "How can I teach you anything if you're too scared to fight?" "I'll fight you," cried Rumo, jumping up. He was itching to cross blades with Ushan DeLuca. He'd been issued with his very first weapon, a rapier, when the lesson began. The hilt felt as warm as Paul, as if it had just come from the smithy. Ushan DeLuca gave a gentle, understanding smile every inch of the fatherly friend and teacher. "So you'd like to fight me, Rumo of Zumonia? You're thirsting for armed combat, eh? Excellent. You aren't like these cowards here. You're a youngster after my own heart. Come here, my son." Rumo stepped forward. His classmates ventured to look up again. DeLuca had settled on his victim. Ushan DeLuca's story. Ushan DeLuca discovered that he was the best swordsman in Zamonia when his life had hit rock bottom. It happened around midnight in a dark side street in the seediest district of Baysville. Almost blind drunk, he had been robbing a helpless farmer with 6 Confederates. Ushan's wild parents had abandoned him in the woods near the town. One day, while rummaging in a municipal rubbish dump for something fit to eat, he fell into the clutches of a dog catcher. The latter shut him up in a big wooden cage with a couple of dozen lice-infested mongrels, and taught him some painful and humiliating lessons on the subject of might is right, until Ushan entered the fast-growing phase and became ruler of the roost. When the dog catcher noticed that he was turning into a big, strong Wolperting and reducing the population of the cage by a dog or two every night, he released him. Having knocked him out with an anesthetic dart in the leg, he loaded him onto a cart and dumped him on the cobblestones in the most disreputable part of town. It was late at night when Ushan recovered consciousness. The bars were overflowing with drunks, and despite his aching head, the Wolperting was irresistibly fascinated by their tipsy shouts and laughter. What impressed him most of all was the way they all went round on two legs. Eager to do likewise, Ushan rose on his hind legs for the very first time and tottered into the nearest tavern, called The Last Stop. It was to be his home for the next 5 years. The landlord, a demi-dwarf from the Dead Mountains, recognized Ushan's earning potential at once because his grandfather had traded in Wolperting whelps. Knowing that such a creature was worth its weight in gold provided you gained its trust, he fed Ushan a big piece of meat, bedded him down on some warm blankets in a little room of his own, and gave him a bottle of rum. When Ushan awoke the next morning, his head was aching even worse than before. The landlord came up to his room, served him a gigantic hangover-cure breakfast, and later on brought him another bottle of rum. Within a few days, Ushan was allowed to eat in a corner of the tap room. After his meals, he would sit there in silence and get drunk. Within a few weeks, he had become so addicted to rum that he couldn't imagine life without it. That was when the landlord, before handing him a new bottle, told him, "Just a minute, nothing in life is free, especially in this place, understand?" Desperately, Ushan groped for the bottle with his paw, but the landlord kept snatching it away at the last moment. "No, of course you don't understand. You're just a stupid, wild Wolperting. But that can be changed. I'm going to teach you to speak and keep you in rum." And it says that, keep you in rum. And in return, I'll spend the next few years taking the fullest advantage of you. Does that sound like a fair bargain? Ushan whimpered. "I'll take that as a yes." The landlord handed over the bottle and Ushan drained it greedily. "Do you realize what first-class tipple that is?" asked the landlord. "It's finest Ushan rum from the cane fields of DeLuca. 58% alcohol, which reminds me, have you got a name?" To begin with, Ushan performed the most menial of barroom tasks. He emptied spittoons, swept the floor, swabbed away blood stains after brawls, rolled beer barrels in, and chucked out drunks late at night. When the landlord noticed that he would always acquitted himself well during punch-ups, he appointed him his personal bodyguard and cashier. From then on, he never had to wash dishes again. His only task was to loiter beside the till with a mug of rum in his paw, look vicious, and beat up any customers who refused to pay. Ushan couldn't imagine a life without hard liquor. In fact, he didn't even know there were creatures that weren't intoxicated from dawn to dusk. The Last Stop and its clientele were his universe. Every customer started the day with a slug of liquor and ended it blind drunk. To Ushan, that was the normal way of life. He also considered it quite natural that none of his acquaintances had a regular occupation other than killing time in the gloomy taproom, or occasionally killing some defenseless drunk for a small change in the yard behind the tavern. His friends had names like Hambone Honko, or Knuckle Duster Newbie, Kosh the Cat, or 12-Fingered Tim, so it was understandable that he didn't learn to play the harp from them. They taught him how to steal, to burgle people's homes, to lose himself in a crowd or the sewers, to mint and pass counterfeit money, to cheat at cards and fence stolen goods. In short, they turned him into a thoroughgoing professional criminal. If Ushan had walked into a bakery or smithy that first night, he might have become a respectable pastry cook or blacksmith, but at the Last Stop, he could only have ended up a crook. His cronies told him that no one but an idiot went to college and learned a trade when there was far easier money to be made. You had only to take what you wanted. The sole requirements were a bit of luck, strong nerves, and an occasional resort to violence. His friends and acquaintances sometimes disappeared for varying lengths of time, and many of them never returned at all. Ushan was then told that they had gone on holiday or left town because there were better career prospects elsewhere. To his friend's regret, Ushan was an inefficient crook. It wasn't that he didn't try. far from it, but he simply didn't have the knack. If he picked a pocket, it was bound to belong to an undercover cop. If he burgled a house, he inevitably trod on the sleeping watchdog, and if he passed forged money, he did so to a member of the fraud squad. His cronies spent most of their time rescuing him from these tricky situations. Ushan was also unsuited to crimes of violence because he refused to carry a weapon, considering this unnecessary in view of his prowess with his fists. As a result, his status in the hierarchy of Bayesville underworld steadily declined until he was entrusted with only the humblest tasks, holding ladders, acting as lookout, or playing the decoy. In the end, he became a lantern-bearer. Lantern-bearers were in fact regarded as members of a very respectable profession in the cities of Simonia. They were paid to escort drunks and strangers home from the taverns, especially in districts where the street lighting was poor. However, they included one or two black sheep who collaborated with criminals by luring their customers to prearranged ambushes. They were to be robbed or sometimes killed. The lantern-bearers would then stand aside and light the cutthroats while they went about their nefarious business. Ushan, who always carried a bottle of rum on principle, was sometimes drunker than his victims. Although he had never been taught to know right from wrong, he felt a distressing sense of guilt, which only strong rum could alleviate, whenever he held the lantern for his false friends to do their nocturnal work. On the night that was to transform his life, Ushan was drunker than ever before. Having found his way to the prearranged spot with the utmost difficulty, he was standing there swaying, and he watched his confederates, a gang of 6 volt heads, who regularly drank away the proceeds in their crimes at the last stop, robbing their victim. The latter was a wealthy farmer from the countryside around Bayesville, an intoxicated demidwarf who had been celebrating a lucrative cattle sale until long past midnight. The farmer had clumsily drawn his sword when he spotted the ambush, but a blow on the wrist sent it clattering to the ground. Ushan, who was standing right beside him, instinctively picked it up, rather like someone politely retrieving a handkerchief. He had never touched a sword before. A remarkable change took place in Ushan DeLuca as he weighed the weapon in his hand. His head cleared for the first time in 5 years. It was as if all the alcohol in his bloodstream had transferred itself to the sword, which now took on a tipsy life of its own. He carved a semicircle out of the mist and skewered it with the tip. Then he described a 5-pointed star, a bird in flight, the outlines of a galloping horse. He laughed aloud. "Hey, look what I can do!" "Stop that nonsense," called one of the bullheads. "And keep your trap shut," called another. Ushan felt as if a weight had fallen from his shoulders. All at once he could see things more clearly than ever before. Everything he'd done up to now, absolutely everything, had been wrong. He couldn't help laughing again. "Tss," he went, imitating the swish of the sword. 6 against 1 isn't fair. Let him go." The Volpheads exchanged puzzled glances. The farmer stood there looking disconcerted. "Tss," Ushan said again. "You heard me. Let him go." The leader of the gang was first to regain his composure. "Keep out of this, you drunken sot." "Tss," Ushan hissed. "What did you call me, 12-fingered Tim?" "I've never been more sober in my life." "Tss. You said my name, you fool." "Now I'll have to kill him. All that drink must have addled your brain." "Tss. I can call you all by name. Knuckle Duster Newbie, Kosh the Cat, Hambone Hunko, Light-Fingered Log, and Wastix, who still doesn't have a nickname because he's too stupid to earn one. As for my name, it's Ushan DeLuca, like the rum." "Are you mad?" cried the farmer. "Now they'll really have to kill me." "You see?" 12-fingered Tim laughed. "Even he thinks so. Push off, Ushan. Take that confounded sword and get lost. We'll deal with this." Tss. "Do you know what this is? It isn't a sword. Oh no, it's part of me. I've grown an extra arm." Tss. "Get lost, Ushan," 12-fingered Tim said in a low, menacing voice. He and the others had all drawn their swords. Tss, said Ushan. "No, you get lost. Leave the poor fellow alone and I'll let you go. That's the deal." Tss. He darted between the bandits as he uttered the last 3 tss, slitting the seat of Kosh the Cat's pants, severing Knuckle Duster Newbie's belt, and giving Light-Fingered Log a dueling scar. "Are you out of your mind?" said Log, clasping his bleeding cheek, but the crooks were still unimpressed. That was merely the signal for battle to commence. Tss, Ushan went softly. Tss. He danced across the cobblestones, light as a feather, and delivered 5 cuts, 5 wounds. Blood welled from the knuckle-duster newbie's arm. Only 12-fingered Tim was still unscathed. Resolutely, he lunged at Ushan, who parried his attack with a trio of nonchalant counterstrokes. And then quickly as lightning, transfixed his heart and promptly withdrew the blade. 12-fingered Tim slumped, lifeless, to the cobblestones. Yes, Ushan said, as though to himself, anyone with a weapon in his paw must be prepared to kill. He took a handkerchief from his pocket, wiped the blood from the blade, and turned to the wounded bandits. You'd better bandage that up, he said, tossing the bloody handkerchief to Newbie. This is the beginning of a new age. The old Ushan DeLuca is dead. Dead is poor 12-fingered Tim here. I'm no longer Ushan DeLuca the Lush. I'm Ushan of the Sword. The 5 bandits backed away, slowly and cautiously, step by step, until the darkness swallowed them up. Ushan turned to the farmer. Is it all right with you if I keep your sword? No offense, but I get the feeling it was made especially for me. The farmer nodded mutely. You can have my lantern in exchange. Ushan's figure melted into the darkness, but his voice could be heard for a while longer. It went. Ushan DeLuca had discovered what he was best at. A bloody nose. Attack me, Ushan commanded. Rumo had pondered his strategy. Ushan DeLuca didn't look too quick on his pins. His poor deportment, the bags under his eyes, his wrinkled jowls, his pince-nez and languid way of speaking, none of these suggested that he was exceptionally athletic. His strong point was probably tactics and experience. Rumo decided to tackle him from below, to thrust at his legs and compel him to a hop. He surely wouldn't be expecting that. Then, when his guard was down, he would hold the blade to his throat. Rumo attacked. Ushan wielded his rapier from the wrist in the way Rumo found inexplicable. He stood there like a fence post and let his blade do the talking, not his body. No matter how often Rumo flexed his knees and thrust at Ushan's legs, the teacher's blade was always there first, ready to deflect its own in an effortless, almost nonchalant manner. He ended by parrying Rumo's onslaughts with one hand in his trouser pocket. Some of the pupils tittered. Yes, very good, Ushan said in a tone that clearly conveyed the opposite, but you must wield your blade from the wrist, not the backside. He flourished the tip of his rapier under Rumo's nose to demonstrate how easy it would be for him to poke his pupil's eyes out. My dear boy, he went on with a hearty yawn, I've fought more exciting duels with the pendulum of my metronome. Someone laughed. Rumo was beside himself. Something impenetrable had interposed itself between him and DeLuca, a barrier composed of countless blades, quite unconnected with physical strength and stamina. It had to do with experience, intelligence, and technical mastery. He realized that he knew nothing, absolutely nothing, about swordsmanship. He caught a sudden glint in the teacher's eyes, but by then it was too late. He felt a sharp, surprising stab of pain, such as he had experienced only once before, in the cave on Roaming Rock, when the demonical hit him in the face with a torch. Ushan had nicked his nose with the tip of his rapier. Rumo began to weep. He couldn't stop himself. The pain brought tears gushing from his eyes. He sobbed uncontrollably. Aha, said Ushan. Not a coward, just a crybaby. Nobody laughed this time, not even Rolf. They could all have been in Rumo's shoes. Very well, Ushan went on, paternally affectionate once more. Sit down on the bench, Rumo. Watch the lesson and memorize the various positions. Next time you can join it. Rumo sat down. Blood was dripping from his nose. Ushan DeLuca proceeded with the normal lesson as if nothing had happened. Having performed a few limbering up exercises, the pupils took up their positions and crossed rapiers. DeLuca rapped out his commands, again and again until universal exhaustion set in. On guard, hit, disengage and hit, lunge position, circular parry and quint, cut at head. On guard, rest. The pupils laid their rapiers aside and dispersed. Rumo's nose stopped bleeding just as the lesson ended. Wood carvings and paperbacks. Whenever Rumo wasn't at school, he enjoyed going to Ornt's workshop and performing his civic duty there by lending him a hand, although a close observer might have concluded that Ornt was assisting Rumo. Rumo could conjure objects out of wood that no one but he had envisioned within it. Not only simple objects like soups, spoons, or combs, but delicate sculptures, richly decorated wooden swords, and ornamental carvings for house fronts. He would take a length of cane, and moments later he had transformed it into an elegant riding whip. Out of a balsa wood offcut he fashioned an artificial bird, light as a feather, that glided through the air for minutes on end. Every day Ornt marveled anew at Rumo's skill and speed with which he worked. With Ornt's help he produced a large conference table for the council chamber in a day and a night. In the days that followed he adorned the table legs with carvings of 4 of the city's principal features: the Woolper Bridge, the Black Dome, the Hoth Windmill, the facade of the City Hall. One lunch break he started whittling away at the massive oak beam over the workshop door. He carved some little scenes from everyday life at the cabinet-maker's workshop, all astonishingly detailed and accurate, Ornt and himself wielding the 2-handled saw, carpenter's tools, the joiner's bench, a portrait of Ornt smoking his pipe. He added some new detail at every opportunity. After initially grumbling that Rumo would spoil his nice doorway, Ornt had since become mightily proud of the splendid entrance to his workshop. Many Wolpertines walked past just to admire Rumo's progress, and Ornt seized the opportunity to talk them into buying a chair or a stool. If Rumo's crowded life left room for anything in the way of spare time, he spent it reading the Prince Singfroid novels. The day he passed his literacy exam, Axel had come to his room with a stack of dog-eared paperbacks, tossed them onto his bed, and fervently extolled their unique qualities. They were, he said, the most brilliant, exciting, and suspenseful books that any Simonian author had ever written. Compared to them, the entire works of Hildegard Mythmaker were fit only for use in public convenience. No one with a heart in his breast could resist the hypnotic appeal of these literary masterpieces. And so it turned out. Although Rumo found the first few pages hard going, he read with growing ease as the time went by and ended by becoming an ardent Prince Singfroid fan. The prince was a character created by Count Clantu of Nerland, a best-selling novelist whose sensational thrillers were universally popular with the younger generation of Simonians. Count Clantu had borrowed the name of his hero from the legend about the Wolpertine's origins recounted in Class by Hara of Midgard. The Prince Singfroid series of novels dealt with a subject in which Rumo was keenly interested, namely heroism of an exemplary kind. Inspired by the noblest of motives, the prince fought the most dastardly villains and horrific monsters, and each of his adventures featured a different, incredibly beautiful princess. Much to Rumo's relief, however, every Prince Singfroid book ended with a description of the hero proceeding on his lonely way because new and appalling dangers required his urgent intervention. Olga of Dulsgaard had taught Rumo to read, but Prince Singfroid taught him to become engrossed in the printed word. The second-best swordsman in Wolperting. "They're getting ready for the annual fair," Urs said one evening. "Have you seen?" Rumo had naturally noticed the activities in progress outside the city walls. Tents and booths had been set up on the edge of the moat, and masses of strangers were miling around out there. It had been explained to him that this was a friendly siege mounted with the mayor's permission. "It'll be a gas, think of it, mulled ale and all the food you can eat." Rumo said indifferently. "Why, aren't you interested in food?" Urs had cooked Rumo an excellent supper, leg of sucking pig and carrots on a bed of pureed potatoes, flavored with saffron. But Rumo had bolted it without comment as usual, and also as usual left half of it. "I like being hungry," said Rumo, as if that explained everything. Well, so you enjoy being hungry. You might just as well say, "I like having a toothache." Rumo pondered this. His mind went back to the time when his teeth were growing. "Toothache has its points," he said. "You're only assigned one municipal friend in your life," said Urs. "And I had to get you, of all people. I suppose I should regard it as a kind of test." "What makes you so interested in food?" "I aim to become the best cook in the city." Why? Well, every Wolperting is the best at something, as you know, and since I could never become the best swordsman here, only the second best, I thought that cooking you, the second best swordsman in Wolperting? That's right. Oh, sure, Rumo laughed. I used to be, at least. Not now, perhaps. More like number 4 or 5. It's ages since I touched a blade longer than my kitchen knife. But I could still hold my own among the first 5, take it from me. Says you. A few years ago, I was the best swordsman in Wolperting. That's official. You can check with the mayor's office. There's even a diploma on the wall there. Pull the other one. Go to the city hall if you don't believe me. Rumo was impressed by Ur's righteous indignation. So how come you used to be the best swordsman in Wolperting, then the second best, and now you don't fence at all? I've never seen you with a rapier in your paw. I don't like weapons, Urs growled, bowing his head. The subject seemed to distress him. Rumo pricked up his ears. You used to be the best swordsman in Wolperting and you don't like weapons? Explain that and you can have my cookie ration for a week. Urs cheered up at that. Have I never told you? No. You never tell me anything either. I'm not good with words. That's true. Come on, tell me, Rumo demanded. The story of Urs of the Snows. Urs sighed. All right. I can't remember it myself, but my foster father told me how he found me as a puppy in the forest of North End, half frozen in the middle of winter. My foster father was Coram Morak, a volped who earned his living as a duelist. What's a duelist? You become a duelist when you've nothing more to lose, including your fear of death, or when you've a screw loose. In Coram's case, it was a bit of both. Professional duelists fight duels for other people, understand? They do it for money. An exciting job. You could call it that. There was never a dull moment at home. I never knew when my foster father went off for work, whether he would come back in the evening. Once he showed up with an arrow through his ear, another time with half a saber snapped off at his back. It wasn't that he earned a lot. Almost anyone could afford a duelist. There were so many of them. In fact, they sometimes fought for a slice of bread and butter. Quite often 2 duelists would do the fighting, while the real antagonists stood there placing bets on their representatives, and in those days people dueled for any old reason. I had to be prepared to become an orphan again, at least once a week. Sounds like a happy childhood. Urs laughed. It could have been worse. It was exciting anyway. Youngsters are only unhappy when they're bored. The worst thing was the food. Coram knew about as much as cooking and eating as you do. Thanks. Yes, it really was intolerable. He used to put sugar in the soup, that sort of thing. The food was appalling, so I took over that part of the housekeeping and when I was old enough. And lo and behold, I enjoyed it. That's how I came to cook. I see. The worst of it was, Coram wasn't very good at dueling. He could fence a bit and shoot a bit with a crossbow, and do a bit of knife throwing, but only a bit of everything. He was tough. That was what had saved him. He didn't slink off home because he'd taken an arrow through the ear. Not him. He didn't lie down and whimper for the doctor after the first flesh wound. He fought on, even if the blood was spurting from 10 wounds. One night he came home white as a sheet, pale as a ghost. I got a terrible shock when I saw him. His opponent had severed 2 arteries, but he'd fought and won, and then sewn up the arteries himself. He lived on a diet of raw calf's liver and pig's blood for 2 weeks, until he could stand without falling over. He'd lost just about everything anyone could have hacked off or shot away. 3 fingers, 1 eye, half an ear, 2 toes, a slice here, a slice there. You could have made a dwarf out of all the separate pieces. That was why I learned to fence. One day I told myself they'll cut the last slice out of him, and he won't be there any more. Urs pointed to Rumo's half-eaten leg of sucking pig. Aren't you going to finish that? Rumo shook his head. Urs grabbed the leg and took a bite. Coram would never have dreamt of getting me to work for him, he went on, chewing with gusto. That was all my idea. When he found me in the snow, he thought I had made an excellent watchdog. He wasn't scared of me the way people usually are, even when I grew up into a big, strong Wolperting. He treated me like his own son. Urs lowered the leg of the pork. So I asked him to teach me to fence. Ostensibly for self-protection, because I spent so much time alone while he was away dueling and so on. He agreed, but the longer we practiced and trained and fought, the more I realized what a poor swordsman he was and how much better at it I was. I had a burning ambition to be more than a match for him, and it really wasn't long before I reached that stage. I didn't let on, mind you. I always held myself in check and allowed him to win, but in reality I got better and better. In fact, I could have disarmed him with a poker. Well, one day he was due to fight a duel for which the other side had engaged Hogg the Hunk. Hogg was the most celebrated and dreaded duelist in the whole of North End, a gigantic brute of a wild boar. It would have been a suicide for Coram to go up against him, and I was at the top of my form, honestly. I couldn't wait to try out my skill in a genuine fight, so I devised a simple little plan. I had to persuade Coram to let me fight the duel in his place. I persuaded him by bringing a coal shovel down on the back of his thick skull. In fact, I nearly killed him. I had to hit him so hard. Then I took our two best sabers and went off to the duel. I told Hogg I was Coram Morak, and he believed me, not being acquainted with my foster father. Well, Hogg was certainly no slouch. He fended me off for a minute or two, and then I systematically took him apart. I didn't kill him. I've never killed anyone in combat. But I left him with so many scars that he never fought another duel. I remember exactly what I thought as I made my way home. I thought, hey, you're pretty good. Funnily enough, though, it didn't give me any pleasure at all. Anyway, Coram just recovered consciousness when I got home. Wow, I said to him, you certainly taught old Hogg a thing or two. A shame he knocked you out just before he hit the ground. Did he? Said Coram. I don't remember. And then I cooked us some supper. We had saddle of lamb and breadcrumbs seasoned with thyme and a cherry tomato salad on the side. Urs took another bite out of the leg of pork. The problem was that Hogg of Hunk now went around showing everyone his scars and telling them what a heck of a fellow Coram Morak was, an invincible magician of swordsmen, and so on and so forth. Well, you know how it is. It wasn't long before every saber rattler in Zamonia wanted to fight this Coram Morak. Urs sighed. The fact was, I dislodged a regular avalanche. Yogur the Butcher, Gollop of the Gulch, Dodgy of the Three Blades, Swatkin the Slayer, Pincushion Pratt, Yambu Yuli, Hoku the Toothless. Every few weeks some brain-dead barbarian would appear outside our shack and challenge Coram to a duel. When that happened, my only recourse was the coal shovel that I went off and riddled my opponent with holes. I told Coram the same story every time he came round, how he'd made a mincemeat of someone but been knocked out at the last moment. In the end, Coram scarcely had time to recover his wits. Between duels, I was afraid he'd become permanently deranged if things went on that way, but I didn't know what else to do. Urs drew a deep breath. Avel the Octopus. Then one day, Avel the Octopus appeared at our door, the most dreaded duelist in all of Zamonia. He had no more arms than you or I. They called him the Octopus because he seemed to have at least 8 when fighting, or so the story went. I went to fetch the coal shovel, but it wasn't there. At that moment it came crashing down on my head, bang, and everything went black. Coram had tumbled to my game. It had gone on long enough, heaven knows, and given me a dose of my own medicine. When I came to, Coram Morak, my foster father, was lying outside in the snow in a pool of blood. Urs emitted a sob. A single tear trickled down his cheek and lost itself in his fur. I took our weapons and scoured Zamonia for Evel the Octopus. This time I was determined to give my opponent more than a few scars. Just this once I was prepared to kill. Oh yes, I was ready to kill all right, but Evel seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. That was when I realized what happens when you take up arms, even in a good cause. One thing leads to another, and in the end the weapon triumphs. Those confounded blades are like vampires. They drink blood and induce you to supply them with some. Sooner or later you realize they wield you, not the other way around. Yes, Rumo said dismissively. All right, but what brought you to Wolperting? The usual thing. I saw the silver thread one day. I found its source in Wolperting, naturally, in the person of Sheena the Snows. But that's another story. Once here I did what you're doing now. I went to school and took fencing lessons. This was before Ushan DeLuca's time. It soon turned out that I was the best swordsman in the city. No one could match my experience. I was even asked to head the fencing school, but I wanted nothing to do with it, honestly not. I did give a few fencing lessons, though, because everyone kept badgering me, telling me it was my civic duty as the city's finest swordsman, etc. Then, when Ushan DeLuca arrived here a few years later, it put paid to my status as the best swordsman in Wolperting. DeLuca is a born swordsman, an absolute natural. Believe me, I was thoroughly relieved when everyone stopped fussing over me. The youngsters these days don't even know I can hold a rapier in my paw. Could you give me some tuition? In what? Fencing, of course. Fencing? I can't fence myself anymore. You just said you were the second best. Fifth best, at most. That's good enough for me, will you? Can't I talk you out of it? No, you should have kept your mouth shut. Urs sighed and gnawed a final shred of pork off the bone. I ought to have sent you away with a flea in your ear when you turned up outside the gates, he said. You were nothing but trouble, I could smell it. Starting the next day, Urs and Rumo used to leave the city late in the afternoon and disappear into the northern woods. Rumo always carried a long cloth-wrapped bundle under his arm, and several of his classmates who had spotted him and his friend wondered what they got up to out there. The truth was, Urs gave Rumo fencing lessons every evening until sunset, and sometimes by torchlight after dark. The bundle contained 2 sabers, 2 rapiers, 2 daggers, which Rumo had carved from hardwood. Although Urs soon recalled the essentials of swordsmanship, he sometimes imparted them in the wrong order. He taught Rumo complicated moves and attacks before simple ones and got a few technical terms mixed up, but in general, Rumo found his tuition more rewarding than Ushan DeLuca's laborious, almost bureaucratic teaching methods. One thing became absolutely clear to him. Urs detested fencing. His aptitude for it not only bored him, but it troubled him. He disliked everything about it. The mechanical movements, the concentration, the discipline, the eternal repetitions. Urs had devised various ways of getting around these rules. Although he taught Rumo those too, it didn't change his opinion that fencing wasn't an art, but a strenuous, tedious, vicious, nonsensical form of sport. Teaching Rumo was a genuine favor to a friend. Urs would so much rather have taught him how to cook, but he couldn't have had a better pupil. Where fencing was concerned, Rumo was almost fanatical in his eagerness to learn. He soaked up Urs's theoretical remarks like a sponge, was tireless in practice, and repeated each exercise to the point of utter exhaustion. Rumo was the driving force. He resisted any attempt by Urs to cut a lesson short or omit it altogether. Even when they got home and Urs had long since retired to bed, he would get out of the fencing manuals he'd borrowed from the library and read until sleep overcame him. Among his reading matter was a slim booklet by Ushan DeLuca, tersely entitled Swordsmanship. Rumo studied that work most attentively of all. Parries and feints. Rumo's lessons in the woods covered the following: how to hold the weapon, the salute, the backwards jump, the forwards jump, the lunge step, the flesh attack, the simple direct hit, the disengage, the hip, the coulee, and then the parries, the direct parry, the parries in prime and second, the seating parries in tierce and court, the riposte and remise, and then the feints, the hit feint, the feint by disengage, the feint by taking the opponent's blade, the double feint, the Delucian feint, the feint, the wishbone feint with remise, the double wishbone feint with remise, the feint with double disengage, the feint at flank and court, the Delucian feint at flank and court, the Ursa's homemade feint in flank and court, which was so bewilderingly effective that the other feints at flank and court could safely be forgotten. Rumo learnt the attack by taking the blade, a direct hit followed by a feint, the beat attack, battering the center of the opponent's blade to force him out of position. The vertical, the horizontal, spiral, and radical modes of disarming an opponent, the latter invented by Urs, the crisscross attack with 2 blades, the concealed parry, a hit delivered from behind one's back, the matador's thrusts downwards through the throat into the heart, and the raging tornado, an attack that required an exceptional amount of practice. And Rumo learnt not only how to launch all these attacks, but how to counter them all as well. He repeatedly practiced the flat slap defense an exercise of which Urs seemed particularly fond. Urs taught Rumo how to wield a blade while lying on the ground, how to defend himself with one paw tied to a tree with one leg buried on the ground. The so-called swamp simulation, they practiced sword plus dagger fencing, in which opponents fought two-handed blades of different length, and weaponless combat, which was really an escape tactic involving leaps, somersaults, and forward rolls, a technique for use when disarmed. They fought in the treetops, swinging from branch to branch like monkeys. They fought in densely wooded terrain with rotten, slippery branches underfoot. They fought while wading through bogs or up to their waists in water. Sorry. Gosh, that scared me. So one of the cats just got an ear mite treatment, but he's okay. Oh, go on. That scared me. I don't know if you heard him, but he's alright. That's actually our most vocal cat. Okay, let me go on. They fought in the treetops, swinging from branch to branch like monkeys. They fought in densely wooded terrain with rotten, slippery branches underfoot. They fought while wading through bogs or up to their waists in water. You never know when it'll come to the crunch, said Urs. It may be winter time and you're ankle-deep in slush or standing on an icy pavement, or it might be nighttime and you're halfway down some rickety cellar stairs in the dark. Those textbook drawings are seldom realistic. Two perfectly posed fencers confronting one another in a dry, well-lit gymnasium. You're more likely to find yourself on a cliff top at night, lashed by flying spray, than it'll be hailing into the bargain. That was why they practiced in all conditions. Any weather was fencing weather, said Urs. 2 dreams and a riddle. Rumo had 2 pet fantasies with which he lulled himself to sleep at night, turn and turn about. In one, he was Prince Sangfroid rescuing... He's okay, it's just his ear. He's got... He must have ear mites, and she's putting ear mite treatment in them. Anyway, Rumo had 2 pet fantasies with which he lulled himself to sleep at night, turn and turn about. In one, he was Prince Sangfroid rescuing Princess Rala from the clutches of an ever-changing succession of monsters or villains. In the other, he was Wolperting's new fencing champion, who deposed the legendary but aging Ushan DeLuca in a breathtaking duel, watched by Rala and the entire fencing class, needless to say. Just as his dreams on Roaming Rock had constantly rehearsed the 2 phases of Smike's plan, so he now pictured himself repaying Ushan's in the same coin with that humiliating nick on the nose. Having first played the fool and launched some clumsy attacks to put the fencing master off his guard, he would then surpass himself in a furious display of swordsmanship, taking his opponent apart until all that remained of him was a whimpering wretch who begged Rumo to take over his teaching post. The vengeful thoughts Rumo entertained towards Ushan DeLuca differed in character from those he had felt for the Demonicals. He would exact a bloodless form of retribution that disarmed and humiliated his opponent with swordsman-like finesse. Olzaton Smike would have approved of his second dream. Smike. Rumo wondered what had become of his corpulent teacher. He would undoubtedly have found Wolperting to his taste had he been permitted to enter the city, a city where combat training was part of the school syllabus. He would also have made an excellent addition to the school staff. Main subject strategy, subsidiary subject Samodian military history. Rumo missed Smike, but he wasn't unduly worried about him. Anyone who had survived Roaming Rock could cope with any situation. Rumo yawned. Then he remembered Smike's farewell riddle. What grows shorter and shorter the longer it gets? A candle? No, a burning candle simply gets shorter and shorter, not longer. Was the answer something visible? Maybe, maybe not. Still pondering this utterly insoluble riddle, Rumo drifted gently off to sleep. Okay, this is Smike's Travels. Smike very soon regretted his decision to part company with Rumo. He berated himself for being an utter fool. Having yielded to a spontaneous whim and dispensed with the amenities of Rumo's companionship, he would now have to forage for food, light fires, and cook for himself. As for the other advantages conferred by the presence of battle-hardened Wolperting, he dreaded to think of them. He had gambled with destiny yet again, but his temperament was such that he quickly accepted his lot. In the next few days he tried to convince himself how wonderful it was not to be hustled along by Rumo, to be able to take a breather whenever he felt like one. He spent several cold and almost sleepless nights because he failed to get a decent fire going and was deterred from shutting his eyes by sinister noises in the surrounding forest. He was not unnaturally exhausted when after a week he met up with a convoy of Midgardian dwarfs, itinerant workers who toured the vineyards and helped with the grape harvest. It required all Smike's powers of persuasion to induce them to give him a ride on one of their donkey carts. Although unconvinced by his claim to be a champion grape-picker, the good-natured dwarfs took pity on him because of his condition and allowed him to climb aboard. Smike found vineyards far more congenial than the wild woods of Simonia. What was more, he discovered to his own surprise that he really could help with the harvest because after a short time his 14 arms enabled him to pick many more grapes than a Midgardian dwarf. He and his companions went from vineyard to vineyard, spending one day at each, and then passed northwestwards at a leisurely pace from Orne to Tintisella, from Nether Mulk to Upper Mulk, from Wimbledon to Moomyville, from Nebraska to Ormiston. To Smike, physical exertion and a nomadic existence were entirely new experiences. After a few weeks, the convoy reached a major outpost of Simonian civilization in the vicinity of the Gargillian Bog Skull, a rock formation reputed to be the petrified cranium of a giant. This district was also known as the Grape Fields because so many wine growers had settled there and transformed it into a veritable paradise for lovers of the grape. There were countless village inns and wineries and a vast number of small vineyards that produced legendary yields. Grape Fields was a fully developed tourist area, and by Smike's standards, It came close to being as much of a heaven on earth as a genuine big city. Bidding farewell to the simple life in the Midgardian dwarf, Smite now roamed around on his own. He lived on his meager savings and an occasional game of cards. This was child's play because people on vacation in Greatfields had money to burn and were far from averse to the odd game of chance. Smite used his winnings to fulfill the visions that had kept him going at the bottom of a slimy pool on Roaming Rock. He lived down his culinary dreams in every detail. Some of the finest chefs in Zamonia had opened restaurants in the Greatfields area, and Smite patronized them all. He went through the meal menus from beginning to end and back again until every memory of his privations had been effaced and converted into body fat. He had truly reached civilization at last. Smite's excursions had naturally taken him into the neighborhood of the Bollig Skull, growing up to its steep limestone slopes, were wild vines that could be harvested only by the flying gargils who inhabited the caves inside the gigantic head. It was said that many years ago a frozen meteor from outer space had struck the Bollig Skull and melted, filling it with the mysterious black water that was the main source of the fabulous wine from which the whole district was famed. The truth wine. Gargilian Bollig Skull, as the wine growers called their wine, was pitch black in color and as thick as molasses. It could not be said to possess any of the characteristics that normally distinguish a wine. It neither refreshed nor relaxed, was guaranteed to spoil a decent meal, had no bouquet or taste, and was not even genuinely intoxicating. What rendered it so unique and sought after was that it allegedly induced a state of mind in which those who drank it learnt the truth about themselves. You couldn't buy it in casks or bottles. It was served only by the glass, and at an exorbitant price, in one particular tavern situated at the foot of the Bollig Skull. Its name, logically enough, was the Bollig Skull. Smike had already heard the Midgardian dwarfs talking about this wine. In fact, the subject always cropped up sooner or later in any conversation. The locals who spoke of it only in mysterious and enigmatic turns intimated that its effects weren't to everyone's taste. The longer Smike spent in the Greatfields, however, the more the wine intrigued him. And so, when he had won enough money at cards, he made his way to the aforesaid hostelry to sample it. He felt a trifle uneasy when he reached the tavern at the foot of the gigantic skull. There were people who had strongly advised him not to touch the wine, and one of his card-playing cronies had even claimed that anyone who got high on Gargilian Bollig's skull was never the same again. But curiosity triumphed, of course, and Smike ventured inside. The tavern was run by greenwood dwarfs, whose hideous appearance created a rather uncomfortable atmosphere. Undeterred, Smike loudly ordered a glass of the legendary beverage. The dwarfish waiter showed him to a table covered with a dirty cloth and promptly disappeared again. Oh, hello, Gerald. Haven't seen you in a while. It isn't my birthday, but it's the birthday of one of my book characters. So, thank you for acknowledging it. I don't know how long I'm going to read, but I can see how long I can try to go. I'll try to go for a while. Smite sat down and surveyed his surroundings. All the customers were sitting by themselves at small tables, each with a glass of black liquid in front of them. Some were brooding in silence, others mumbling to themselves, and many pulling faces horrific enough to suggest that they were suffering from convulsions. A few were actually weeping. The place looked more like the recreation room of a lunatic asylum than the tap room of an inn. The greenwood dwarf returned with a glass of black wine, deposited it on the table, and disappeared without a word. Smike took a cautious sip. He felt cheated. The wine tasted of nothing. Absolutely nothing, not even water. What a fool he was. He'd fallen for an old wives' tale, for the oldest tourist trap in the district. Remembering how expensive the wine was, he decided to make a fuss when the waiter reappeared. Perhaps he could get out of paying the bill. He looked up and gave such a terrible start that he spilt the rest of the wine on the grubby tablecloth. Seated across the table from him was himself, Smike's alter ego. "No, your eyes don't deceive you," said his alter ego. "It's you. You're me. I'm you. You're looking at yourself." "Heavens," said Smike. "I wasn't prepared for this." No, there was no mirror. It was his doppelganger, all right. Nobody's prepared for it, curiously enough. It's only logical, though, when you come to think about it. After all, who is better qualified to tell you the truth about yourself than yourself? "Man, oh man," said Smike, fanning himself with several pairs of arms at once. "This is really incredible. I need some time to take it in. You look so real." "I'm as real as you are. Have some more wine." "No thanks, I've had enough. Any more and there might be 3 of us sitting here." "It's not like getting drunk. You can't improve on your present condition. What you see is what you get." "I might just as well have looked at a mirror," said Smike. "It would have been cheaper." "Yes, exactly. You're seeing what you'd see in a mirror, but much quicker." "How do you mean much quicker?" "Wait and see. Look at me. Concentrate on me." "You mean you're going to show me something?" "I'm already doing so. Look closer." Smike stared at his alter ego. Yes, it was himself, his exact mirror image. A trifle weary-looking, perhaps, but after all that had happened recently. But did he really look that old? Yes, he probably did by now, but just a minute. Those little crow's feet beneath his eyes, surely they hadn't been there this morning, or had they? No, definitely not. This wasn't a very good likeness of him, after all. It was more like a poor imitation of a waxworks. And this was supposed to be the real thing? Smike eyed the wrinkles suspiciously. Suddenly there were more of them, and more. Big bags were forming beneath the eyes of his alter ego. "Just a minute," muttered Smike. His alter ego grinned. "You caught on at last, huh? It's not a prison. It isn't a pretty sight." Smike had caught on all right. This wasn't a poor imitation. It was a perfect likeness of himself in 10 or 20 years' time. He was watching himself grow older. His alter ego's skin was becoming drier, grayer, more wrinkled. Discolored flecks appeared, warts took shape. Smike shivered. His alter ego grinned, baring its teeth. They were yellow and longer than usual. The gums receded and became inflamed. The necks of the teeth were exposed and turned brown. One rotten black stump detached itself from the pale diseased gum and dropped off on the table. "Whoops," said his alter ego. This was going decidedly too far, thought Smike. He was watching himself dying, not just growing older. "Stop it," he entreated, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the gruesome sight. His alter ego's skin had creased into thousands of tiny folds. The face was puckering into an overripe plum. The hands and arms were little more than skin and bone, and they too began to fall apart and drop off. Smike could make out the individual bones and desiccated sinews. "Stop it, I said," gasped Smike. He burst into tears. "No can do," said his ghastly doppelganger. "The truth is inescapable. Well, it's been nice having a drink with you, brother of mine. Just remember this." It leant forward, bared its rotting teeth in a frightful grin, and whispered, "They'll be coming to fetch you." Then it broke into a sinister laugh. It laughed until it choked on its own vocal cords. As the last peal of laughter died away, the lower jaw came adrift and fell off on the table. A grey tongue lolled from the open throat, then that too fell off and exploded into a puff of dust. Smike uttered a high-pitched cry. A voice behind him said, "Can I get you something else, sir?" He spun around. The dwarfish waiter was standing there, eyeing him malevolently. "What? Would you care for something else, sir? Some cheese, perhaps?" "No thanks," said Smike. He turned to look at his frightful companion, but there was no one there. The chair on the other side of the table was empty, the table itself bare of teeth and other detritus. The nightmare was over. "Yes, the truth is hard to endure," said the waiter. "Lies are nicer, we all know that. But it changes your outlook, seeing things telescoped like that. May I bring you the bill?" "Yes, please," Smike said hastily. "And be quick about it." He waited, breathing heavily, for the dwarf to return. Sweat was oozing from every pore of his body. He paid the bill and the waiter escorted him to the door. "Just wait, you'll soon feel better. The putrefying effect takes time. You'll feel newborn." The dwarf gave a frightful laugh. "It'll change your life, believe me." he called as Smike disappeared into the darkness. Goodbye forever. No one ever pays us a second visit. On the warpath. Smike left Greatfields early next morning and set off. He had scarcely slept a wink all night. Even though he did doze off, all he saw were visions of his rapidly aging self who kept whispering, "They'll be coming to get you." There was no time to be lost. He'd wasted so much of it in that accursed roaming rock. There were things to do apart from fleeing wine bibbers with a few cheap card-sharpers' tricks and using the proceeds to eat his way through the menu of every restaurant in Greatfields. His other recurrent vision during the night was of Professor Ostafan Calibri. Instead of horrifying him, however, it filled him with hope. He now realized that he had instinctively headed in the same direction as the professor had taken when they parted. The knowledge with which Calibri had infected him was having an alter effect that Nocturnomath had omitted to mention. Smike wanted more of it. His thirst for scientific information had been whetted, and his store of knowledge was posing new and urgent questions which only the professor could answer. If the readiness of Simonian bees to discuss matters by haptic means were allied with the floral transmission of information, would it not be possible to develop an apiarius language capable of verbally stimulating their honey output? If the surgical instruments in the non-existent Teeny's subcutaneous submarine can start a dead heart beating again, to which parts of the anatomy should they be applied? And if it were possible to start a dead heart beating again, would that not be a first step towards combating the inexorable fate so drastically demonstrated to Smike by his alter ego? Following in Calibri's footsteps meant defying fate and declaring war on death, and Smike was an expert on war, for had he not been Prince Hussein Banana's war minister? Yes, when he conjured up the vision of that puny pigeon-chested gnome of a scientist, he clearly perceived that Calibri needed a powerful ally in his fight against almighty death. It was Smike's wish, nay, his destiny, to follow the professor to Merkholm as quickly as possible. Tarantula and the Demonic Ferryman. The further Smike progressed through northwest Samonia, waking for the coast, the sparser the signs of civilization became. The Arcadian landscape of Greatfields gave way to monotonous, almost deserted prairies inhabited by sheep farmers who were among the poorest members of Samonian population. Gone were the taverns and wine shops, and no one here was free enough with his money to risk it on a game of chance. Smike occasionally happened upon a farm, where he could obtain a bed of straw and a meager breakfast in return for a small sum, but in general he had to content himself with a diet of raw vegetables. As a result, his financial reserves and all the fat he put on in Greatfields gradually melted away like butter in the sun. The climate became steadily harsher. The everlasting east wind had scoured the landscape into a flat and featureless expanse, and bent every tree and blade of grass into submission. A thin drizzle fell without ceasing. Smike knew that in Tarantula the district through which several rivers flowed oceanwards from the Gloomberg Mountains. There were some small villages which were so-called demon boats could be hired to take one further. Only the most audacious travelers availed themselves of this inexpensive form of transportation, for the demon boats were diminutive craft manned by ferrymen of semi-demonic ancestry, who always shot toward Tula's dangerous rapids by night. However, Smike was becoming so sick of the monotonous scenery that he decided to take the risk. The very look of the boat he boarded in one of the villages, which was crisscrossed by several small rivers, made an unnerving impression on him. It was coal-black and shaped like a grotesque demonic head with horribly gaping jaws. He took his place in it, accompanied by the ferryman, who was muffled up in a black cloak. Seated behind Smike, he made not the slightest attempt to steer and spent the whole time cackling incessantly. At first they glided leisurely downstream, and Smike had just concluded that the ferryman's infuriating laughter was the worst feature of the voyage, when the boat put on speed and the demonic pipes mounted on the cabin roof began to wail in the wind. It proceeded to shoot the rapids at a rate of which Smike would never have believed a river craft capable. Flung ever more violently to and fro by the currents, the boat rotated on its own axis and stood on its head by turns, submerged completely, regained the surface, and plunged down several waterfalls. Although unafraid of drowning, being a semi-aquatic creature, Smike thought it quite possible that he would be smashed to pieces against the hull. Either that, or he would go insane with fear and join in the ferryman's demented laughter. But the boat soon reached its destination unscathed. Smike was still alive and in his right mind. What was more, he had covered a lot of ground with an incredibly short time. He was now near the coast just south of Merkholm. Merkholm Lighthouse. Seen from far off, Merkholm resembled a gigantic fair-weather cloud that had fallen from the sky. The sight of it rejoiced Smike's heart for at least 4 reasons. First, he had arrived. No more prairies, no more expanses of razor-sharp grass, no nights filled with the howling of wolves, no forests inhabited by whispering shadows. Second, Merkholm was a city. Not a particularly big one, but a genuine city with live inhabitants. Third, there was Professor Calibri. Smike looked forward to all of the conversations with which they would while the nights away. Fourth, the cloud looked like a freshly washed sheep. Nothing in its appearance was reminiscent of all that superstitious claptrap about ghostly Merkholm. Smike waddled towards the city, filled with expectancy. As soon as he entered the cloud, however, the world underwent a change. Colors faded, sounds died away, outlines became blurred. Everything was silent, soft, and peaceful. Smike instantly felt snug and secure. The architecture seemed rather monotonous. The only buildings in sight were squat, circular, and built of stone, and the streets were hardly teeming with urban life. All Smike saw were a few dark-robed figures slinking through the fog, but he was sure he could find his way to the lighthouse unaided. It could only be situated where it belonged, beside the sea, so he simply made for the roar of the waves and soon found himself on a sandy white beach. The sea! Oh dear! And on roaming rock he had solemnly vowed never to go near a wave again. Jutting skywards on the horizon, almost invisible in the billowing fog, was the slender gray shape of a lighthouse. What a picturesque spot for a stimulating exchange of ideas, thought Smike when he got there. The sea within sight, miles of sand dunes available for long walks, the mysterious fog very atmospheric. To the sound of rolling breakers, he and Calibri would discuss important aspects of science and philosophy, and empty the odd bottle of wine, and it certainly wouldn't be Gargillian Bollock's skull. How healthy the sea air smelt! Smike knocked again on the lighthouse door, once, twice, again and again. He called the professor's name. No one at home? Well, Calibri probably wouldn't mind it if he went inside waiting for him. Was the door locked? No. Then the professor couldn't have anything to hide. In he went. Aha! A laboratory. Great, the professor really had settled in here. The place was very untidy. When was the last time anyone had cleaned it? Scientists, they had more important things to do than tie their shoelaces and wield a duster. What were those pieces of equipment? Test tubes, Bunsen burners, vials, flasks containing mysterious liquids. Smike couldn't wait for the professor to explain everything to him. He could already see himself amid the test tubes, Calibri's otoscope on his nose, searching for an effective antidote to death. A glass retort of incredible delicacy, a masterpiece of the glass-blower's art, lay shattered on the floor. An accident, no doubt. And what was that? A black doll floating in a flask of clear liquid, like a tiny victim of drowning. Smike called again. Professor Calibri? No answer. The diary. A spiral staircase led to the chamber in which the lantern must once have burned. It was lighter up there, a big panoramic window wreathed in white fog. On the floor, a mattress, some blankets, and a pillow, very aesthetic. Books strewn everywhere. Smike picked one up. Diary of a Sentimental Dinosaur by Hildegard Mythmaker. Well, well. He tossed it aside and picked up another. The monosemanticization of polysemients and Gralsundian cave literature. The things that scientists took an interest in. Smike threw the book on the floor and picked up a third. No title? He opened it at the first page. Neatly inscribed on it in black ink were the words, Professor Ostafan Calibri's Lighthouse Log. Smike dropped the book as if it were a poisonous snake. A log! A form of diary! How discourteous of him to stick his nose into such a thing! It probably contained revelations of a most intimate nature. At least he was now 100% certain that the professor was living here. It would be only a matter of time before he turned up. Excellent! Smike made his way downstairs again. It was already late that night when Smike began to feel genuinely worried about the professor. How many hours had he been waiting? What could be keeping Calibri so long in this desolate part of the world? It was pitch dark outside, and the salt-laden wind was bitterly cold. Smike roamed the laboratory, fidgeting. Why was it so untidy? What was that strange little corpse in the flask? Could something untoward have happened after all? In need of distraction, Smike went upstairs to fetch a book. His eye lighted on the diary again. Should he risk it? Never. But what if it contained some clue to the professor's whereabouts, some clue that might save his life? Smike picked up the diary and began to read. Day 1. Merkholm at last! What a disaster-ridden journey! 2 months in the clutches of Sylvanar pirates. I could write an entire book about that episode alone, except that it would be devoted mainly to the distasteful subject of cannibalism. If those apes hadn't been so monstrously demented, I should never have escaped, and my 4 shriveled brains would now be dangling from a belt, together with other fetishes. Wasted another month in a godforsaken place called Nethermolk, confined to a bed by a bout of demonic flu, sensational hallucinations. For a week I imagined I was a diamond. 6 other less protracted delays helped to double the length of my journey, but enough of that. Moved into the disused lighthouse today. It's not particularly big, and the lantern was extinguished long ago. Will easily be able to black out the windows and make myself at home here. Visibility in Merkholm agreeably restricted. The perpetual fog makes an effective sunlight filter, an excellent place in which to work and meditate. My intellectual powers perceptibly increased when I entered the fog, by 50% at a rough estimate. My scientific equipment has already arrived. Can't wait to see how it has survived the long journey. Tomorrow, stock-taking. Now to unpack. Day 2. After going without sleep for almost 2 weeks, I actually slept for 8 hours last night. What a luxury. Feel regenerated, brimming with energy. My brains are rotating. The climate suits me admirably. Breakfasted on my remaining provisions for the journey, then settled in. There are 2 rooms. The first, a large one downstairs, immediately inside the front door, fireplace with a saucepan. A table, 2 chairs, no windows, perfect. This will be my laboratory. A spiral staircase leads upwards through an empty space of the former lantern chamber. A large circular room, but surrounded by windows, therefore unsuitable as a laboratory. The fog presses up against the panes like cotton wool. Very picturesque. I shall read and sleep up there. Unpacked the crates. Most things have withstood the journey remarkably well, the few breakages being manageable. The inventory. 1. Labyrinthine test tube and glass double helix. Really amazing that these delicate gems of the glassblower's art arrived in one piece. 2. Electrical egg plus vacuum pump. 3. Linden hoop theodolite. 4. Silver fuseli corker plus complete set of corks. 5. Spectroscope in chameleon skin case. 6. Pneumatic suction pump. 7. Candlelight heliostat. 8. Pendolene trigonometer. 9. Ostoscope. One lens cracked, but I have a spare. 10. Aneroid barograph. 11. Muslin hygrometer. 12. Fibonacci spiral plus candlelight propellant and the relevant indigo prisms. 13. The aurograph. Also the copper, lead, and gold weights for calibrating the aurograph. 3 dozen aurographic plates plus emulsion. Powdered zinc, a plummet, the aura threads, 6 meters. 1 liter of mercury, some lead-sealed radium powder. A 6-tongued slide rule, camphor solution, a flask containing a laden mannequin, and nutrient fluid, inanimate. An alchemical battery, working attire, lead apron, lead helmet, lead gloves. The crate containing minor oddments, measuring glasses and bowls, filters, chemicals, alchemical extracts, mortars, etc. 5 barrels of dried cod and a Hodlerian sieve for